Hi, my name is Ruth-Anne, and it is a privilege to be here with you virtually to present some of our organization's thoughts on the future of living spaces. So just a bit of an introduction. I envisage is a think tank. Actually, it's a think and do tank. We like to call it that. And that's dedicated to research and development for the built environment of our cities, Ghanaian cities. And really, the way we relate to this subject of living spaces is in the sense where to envisage is, to conceive, the desirable future that you want, future outcomes. So really, I kind of connected with the idea of this presentation because really it's at the heart of what we like to do. Okay, so we are really focused on being able to kind of develop from the macro, looking at spatial development, looking at urban planning, looking at the details as well. And that's just a bit of what we do showing up on the screen, you'll see. So we're going to go into the heart of what we're discussing as living spaces. And we want to sort of see how we can begin this critical discourse. What does it mean for us to envisage a future beyond COVID? I think was the point of the entire discussion. So just a bit about what we also do with publications. We like to also focus on the creative aspect, coming through with written publications. And we have a journal called the Architect's Newsletter. So back to the critical discourse. I think that to be able to discuss anything in terms of the future, you need to be able to look back to what the past occurrences are, and it's something that we focus on in terms of our research. We like to do a lot of what has been done before, what was our situation before even COVID, before climate change, and there was a profound statement made by Odile Deck about 4 or 5 years ago that simply said that if we really had to think about it, the idea of us, our world as we know it, is something that we'll have to rethink. And so a lot of what we do is to realize that we are in a state of crisis, whether it was before COVID, during COVID, or after COVID. And these are some of the things that we like to think about. This is our city. This is more or less the civic commercial precinct of Accra. You'll see EcoBank somewhere in the view. So this is a pretty good picture of the hope of the city. Within this, you also have this reality. This is also our city. This is also Accra. And we're looking at the situation building up after COVID and some of those conversations that we begin to have to expose what really we're thinking about happening after COVID. So post-COVID, we're still going to be dealing with climate change. That's still real. And we still have our ongoing housing crisis. That's also real. You put that in with our environmental issues. We still have rainfall issues we're dealing with. We still have sanitation we're dealing with. And you realize that we're back almost at the same point, just with more awareness of how fragile the state of our cities really are. And so discussing living spaces is really to discuss the housing situation we have and now to confront it head on and try to think about those radical ideas for how we can develop beyond the situation we're currently faced with. So how do we begin to do that? This is an example of housing in Nima, and it's very encouraging to me that we have now a ministry set up for this purpose of looking at inner cities and zongos. A few stats on where we are as that development. You still have the average percentage of households having very limited statistics as far as space is concerned. But each house within that kind of setup or environment has almost 94% being linked on to electricity. So average bedroom per family size is still 1.92. Your average room structure is still doing 9. And you look at the kind of social structure that goes with our typologies and the fact that we're still, the idea of laterally spreading is still something that we're very much involved in. And you realize the whole system just has to overhaul itself. Um, how do we begin to do that, though, is the heart of this discussion. Okay, so with understanding the future of living spaces, we're going to be doing a bit of reconnaissance into the past. And this is what we do as I envisage. We sort of, like I said earlier, take up these projects, these research projects, into what were our living spaces like, 40, 50 years ago. Our present, what we already know as standard way of operating green buildings, and then what we can kind of take out from that as our future. This is a research project that we undertook for Kumasi staff housing, KNUST specifically, and it has these treasure troves of really interesting typologies that we felt was interesting to document. We work with a lot of students on these kind of projects. This is a depiction of KNUST back in the day. You'll see what we have in terms of the housing arrangements, housing typologies, a lot of focus on passive building orientation. So this clearly shows you that it's been actualized before. We have a lot of focus on specifically passive design because it's the easiest way of confronting the challenges we have set before us, especially in terms of housing. And design never needs to be that cumbersome. I think the simplest solutions, always start with the most basic understanding of what the challenge is. So that's a bit of the work that we've done in sort of researching how was this made to last and stand the test of time. And we're still doing research into the fact that energy consumption 40, 50 years ago is kind of still the same, as they have now, which is fantastic for us. So we will bring it quickly into the present context. And this is a project in Chado. It's called the Inside Out House. And really, what this project was seeking to do was to give as much connection to the outdoors as you have indoors. And the client was very specific about that. But the challenge for us was how do we keep a facade like this, which is purely on the western side, still respect the fact that the building has to be responsive and responsible ecologically. So you have a lot of emphasis on your overhangs, on your shading devices. And the main brief of this was to be able to set out a building that would do almost 50% built to unbuilt space. So the real challenge came with how do we overhaul this idea of setting the building footprint before the landscaping. So we said, let's do this in reverse. Let's actually have our focus on the landscaping. Let's make sure that we can do as much as 50% unbuilt space. Let's plan out, the open spaces and then fit the footprints onto the sites. So it worked out really interestingly for us where we could focus on back and front green spaces and dedicate as much as over 200 square meters to that outdoor living space. Right? So naturally, what you tend to have with that kind of configuration is an L, an L footprint, and we really focus on that to build and develop the massing for this. And so we at the point where we're looking more and more into these sort of easy ways of interfacing with green technology in a passive sense. This is where we are as at last month. COVID slowed things down just a little bit, but we're very focused on the materiality here. And what we tried to do here was use blocks that aren't your standard 150. We're doing 200 blocks, which would really give us the sort of tempering of the indoor climate that you want within a building like this. Okay. So we're putting all of that together into coming to the focus of this being what do our future spaces, how do we see our future spaces looking like? What do we want for the future of, living spaces? And we wanted to discuss this in a speculative project called Plug House. And Plug House is simply looking at units. It's looking at the idea of modularity and coming up with the sense of what does it take to make the living activity work in a space that is very, very tight, very set out in areas that you haven't really been too generous with. And it came back to this idea of a 6.6 by 6.6 footprint, and keeping it square and compact really helps with the idea of setting out the unit. So in this kind of discussion, you'll see we've sort of tried to play with typologies within this space. And within each of them, you're looking at different sort of cultural variations to this. So how do you begin to develop off a model like this? And what are the sort of proportions that you need to keep into mind, making sure that your anchor, your wet anchor can sort of then orient you around, you know. And the interesting part for us in this was realizing that you can achieve quite a bit within an area like this. I mean, each mid-grid being 2.2, that's enough space to see a lot of living processes happen, both resting areas, sleeping areas, living areas, or the more public areas of the space. And you begin to see how each plane of the building can kind of play a really major role. So we had a lot of floor to ceilings. We focused a lot on being able to utilize the space, move about the internal partitions to make way for other activities. So a lot of flexibility afforded within something like this. And I think this is an idea that really works as a basic unit. And then from there we can expand to the larger idea of what future living spaces should be like. But this was sort of sitting it into the context of some of the areas that we'd researched. So Nima, what's important to you culturally? Is the idea of being able to be exposed to the rising sun something that we have to look at, and so on and so forth. So those kind of things are things that we want to give some focus to in deciding what we can live within. Okay, so we've already talked about it being modular. We are looking at the idea of it being prefabricated. And we're also looking at the idea of the energy efficiencies of this type of module. And just because we have this focus on materiality being our stumbling block and the costs involved with a lot of building materials, we've sort of discussed quite a number of them, but we've happily chanced on this idea of using a system called the EPS. And it's quite a bit of work that we've been putting into it to make sure that we can test this module for mass housing like this. So the EPS is simply the expanded polystyrene, the polystyrene being the insulation that is sandwiched in between a 3D mesh layer, and it's then shotcreted. It's basically a concrete structure. This is going to give you some idea of what we've been doing within a period of time. So basically, you work all your services into this idea of the building sheet, and it's as simple as that. But what we've realized with this is we have a really big opportunity to achieve a lot of the things that you want for a building envelope. Okay, so in addition to the fact that you can have load-bearing and non-load-bearing elements within the building, I feel it's more cost-effective. I feel that it offers a lot more permeability in terms of water resistance, things like that. It's thermally insulative, and so you're getting everything within one idea of a structure. And so we want to see how we can begin to bridge this idea of this material into our housing prototypes, only because then we can do away with the discussion of building at a certain level being too expensive. And the idea to do this prefab, this is a 1.2 by 3 meter wide panel, and so it works. But the other aspect of the future of our living spaces is the idea of verticality. and I don't think that's played in enough. This is a schematic sort of showing what we already know, being the sprawl, and how we can condense all of that into the idea of this, single spire. We already know what the stats tell us, that you have a situation where we're going to be having to do 190 to almost 200,000 housing units in a year to make up for a 10-year deficit. So what you want to be able to do within a very short period of time is condense a lot of these ideas of mass housing, into one. And so these are some of the ways that we kind of go about thinking about the future of space, working a tight unit, making sure that you can afford all of those processes going on um, within that single, tight space. But then also beginning to look at more the external linkages and, conventional ways of circulation actually playing in now as part of your living space. So your stair area is no longer your stair area. It's more, places of convergence. How do we dissolve this idea of a straight circulation now being more fluid, in terms of ramping, and allowing for a lot of, activity and social processing, happening within areas like that. So this is the point to which, we come up the development of things and scale it up to the idea of multi-housing. And a lot of the processes, I mean, these are very simple concepts on what we already know to be the way of achieving green buildings, but scaling it up and making sure that you can contextualize the conversation a little better. So if you're thinking about setting this up, in terms of your modules, you're already working with the idea of these cubes sort of coming together, and you have very different typologies in order to play this out. So we want to try to do a lot more work in sort of prototyping, the basic units, and then expand the idea a bit more. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Yes, so what we did say is that, present situation, and for a lot of clients, it's very difficult to convince the idea of, earth blocks and so on and so forth. We've had some success, but where we can begin to nudge the public in the right direction is at beginning to, encourage this idea of, okay, you're doing more of a thickness, and I talked about it being a 200 block rather than the conventional 150. But what we realize is that it sort of gives the same performance, thermal performance, as you would with, the earth blocks, which, yes, do offer a lot more cooling, but you're going to be able to achieve more or less the same indoor environments, that you would with earth blocks. So it's a very gradual conversation, and the more it is that you can begin to convince people that it actually works, the more they're willing to put up into the starting costs to procure more of these materials. And really, if we want to change the way industry operates, these are some of the conversations and some of the leanings that we have to be able to nudge in terms of design more of our public into. So yes, I felt we were very successful with pushing as much as we have, the idea of an alternate way of doing things, although cost is always an issue that, your clients will grapple with. Thank you.